thanks so much. And Guilherme, thanks so much for the invitation to participate in this session. Um, so I think when I first started trying to put this presentation together, it felt a little bit awkward because I think when I initially read this manuscript, it was with the intention of writing the foreword to the book. And I think when you read a manuscript in that way, your intention is really only to find the valuable contributions of the text and to try to make those as clear as possible. So it was interesting to have the opportunity to come back to the text again and look at it with a more critical eye. But I think what I'm going to do here is still kind of reiterate one aspect of what I found very valuable about the text and expand on that in a way that's a little bit different from how I talked about it in the foreword. And then toward the end here, I'll come to some kind of more critical questions. And these questions really are about, I guess they operate at a practical, even pragmatic level. They're really questions about the extent to which we can really take this work and use it more broadly in psychiatry and use it to inform clinical practice. Because I think that's obviously one of Messas' aims in this text. And I think he does a very good job of showing just how valuable phenomenology is for us to understand these particular clinical cases. But I'll bring up some potential issues there that we might want to work through. So one thing that I find extremely valuable about the text is this kind of framework that Messas offers us in part 1 of the book. So that's what I'll focus on here. And right, there's this important sense in which we don't just get from this book a detailed phenomenological study of substance misuse. We're also provided with a kind of general framework that others might use to do phenomenological research on other kinds of psychopathological conditions. Right? The framework is kind of broad enough that it captures much more than just substance misuse. And I think there's really 2 main aspects of this framework that we're offered. One is this important distinction between the anthropological level and the structural level. And the other aspect is that Messas actually walks us through precisely how he understands each of the main phenomenological concepts like temporality and spatiality and so on. So I think at first, when someone looks at this text in this lengthy section, I think it's over 50 pages of outlining all of these concepts, it might seem like this is fairly kind of introductory material, so that if you already have a background in phenomenology, then this is something you might be able to skip over. But I think it's really not the case. I think that having this kind of detailed account of how exactly Messas thinks about each of these concepts and understands them, I think that's actually a really important contribution of the book. And the main reason for that is that I think a lot of these concepts are so widely used in phenomenology now, concepts like temporality, for instance, that when we start using these in phenomenological psychopathology, we end up kind of discussing them as if we all have a shared meaning, as if we all mean the same thing by temporality, because we all have some background in philosophical phenomenology and in how it's been applied in psychopathology and so on. But even in just kind of the classical philosophical text, there really isn't that much agreement over how a lot of these concepts are understood and articulated. Right? The way that Husserl articulates temporality differs from how Heidegger articulates temporality, which differs from how Merleau-Ponty discusses it, and so on. So I think it's actually really important to have this opportunity for those who are doing this more kind of engaged or applied work to walk us through precisely how they understand each of these concepts and precisely how they aim to use them and apply them in their own studies. Because I think that allows for the opportunity for much more kind of critical engagement between people working in this field at this very fundamental, philosophical or theoretical level. And especially when it comes to this distinction between the anthropological level and the structural level, I think this is an extremely valuable contribution because it's something that, as you read through it, you might think, well, that seems to be kind of implicit in most of the other work that I read in phenomenological psychopathology. And I think it's true. It is implicit in that work, but since it's implicit, it's not always, again, used in exactly the same way. I think a really good example of this is how we see that kind of distinction in the background of Ludwig Bittenswanger's work. So there are some cases, well, he does use the word anthropological, and he refers to, doing studies at something like an anthropological level. And then he contrasts that, since he's drawing on Heidegger here, with an ontological level. And that distinction, the anthropological ontological distinction in Binswanger's work, I guess on the surface, seems to be pretty closely aligned with what Messas calls the distinction between the anthropological and the structural. But I think if we look more carefully here, the way Messas draws this distinction is actually much clearer than the way we have it in Binswanger's work. And that's in part because I think Binswanger was struggling a lot with the actual stance that he took with respect to this distinction. And we see this also with Heidegger's own kind of critiques of Binswanger in the Zolikon seminars, where he says that Binswanger actually misunderstood the meaning of the ontological and things like that. Because if you look at how Binswanger is using this kind of distinction, which again seems to be the same distinction that Messas is using, there are some cases where Binswanger, I think, kind of toes the Heideggerian line and says, look, psychiatrists are just operating at the anthropological level. We use this ontological understanding from philosophy to kind of guide us, but all of our studies are conducted at the anthropological level. But then there are other cases where Binswanger seems to take a kind of more radical position, and he suggests that actually there are alterations or changes that occur at the ontological level for at least certain kinds of conditions. But he never really kind of comes down, I think, clearly on one side or the other. I think there's a lot of ambiguity in his work. And I think we see that ambiguity in other classical work and even other contemporary work, sometimes because someone's not really sure where they come down on it, or sometimes because it's not immediately clear at what level some of this research is actually operating. But I think with this very kind of straightforward distinction that Messas provides us, and he clarifies precisely what he means by the anthropological level, what he means by the structural level, what their relationship is, what their potential interactions are, right? We get all of that kind of upfront. And the value here isn't so much to say that this is a framework that everyone else working in the field of phenomenological psychopathology will agree with. I think the real value is that those who agree or disagree can now kind of clarify where they stand with respect to this distinction. And they might argue, for instance, that we need more levels than just the two, or they might argue that we really should understand all of these alterations at an anthropological level, not a structural level, and so on. But it's only by making this distinction very clear in the first place that we can begin to have those kind of, I guess, meta or fundamental debates. So that, I think, is one of the things I found very valuable at Messas' work. Keeping that in mind, I want to ask some questions now that I think have a bit more of a kind of critical orientation. So I've already said that this framework and this conceptual clarity is really important for the field as a whole. But I also wonder whether this kind of, I don't know, not just a conceptual rigor, but this kind of proliferation of key phenomenological concepts and ultimately what we might call phenomenological jargon, whether the proliferation of this within the field might actually have a potentially negative effect on the uptake of phenomenology within psychiatry and clinical psychology more broadly. And so I think one of my concerns here, and again, I'm very sympathetic to this kind of conceptual clarity, right? This is something that I think we should all strive for in our work. But I do have this worry that maybe by kind of solidifying these frameworks and developing this set of technical terminology that we operate within our own field that doesn't really match on to the kind of terminology that's being used in psychiatry and clinical psychology more broadly, I'm worried that that might drive an even deeper wedge between phenomenological psychopathology and other approaches within psychiatry and clinical psychology. In much the same way that we might see a wedge drawn between, or kind of driven in between, say, Freudian approaches, right? There was a point at which Freudian approaches, I think, permeated psychiatry, but eventually it became this kind of self-siloed theoretical framework. And because no one really knew or paid much attention to the specific jargon and concepts they were using, that kind of work had less of an influence. So I guess my questions for Guilherme now are really about what do we do about this? It seems like there are a few different options we might have. One is that maybe we kind of embrace these terms like the anthropological structural distinction and continue to use them in work that we try to publish in major psychiatric journals so that they actually enter, broader psychiatric discourse, so that people who aren't working in phenomenology become more familiar with them. Right? I think that's one approach that we might take. Another approach is maybe something like having this very refined technical discourse and set of concepts that we use when we're engaging with others within our subfield, right? Other phenomenologists and phenomenological psychopathologists, but then find ways to kind of shed that jargon or put it to the side when we start engaging with people outside of this particular subfield and want to engage with psychiatry and clinical psychology more broadly. So I know, Guilherme, you already have plenty of experience in kind of navigating these boundaries and moving from this kind of clearly phenomenological approach to clinical psychiatry and issues in psychiatry and clinical psychology more broadly. So I'd love to hear what you think about this. What do you think this is really an issue? And if it is, how do you think we might address it?
Great. Thank you, Anthony and Anna, for your commentaries. And I think you posed a couple of questions there. I was going to come back to Guilherme. I know it might be a bit more challenging to be looking at both those commentaries, which go into quite a bit of depth. Guilherme.
Thank you, Ashok. How much time, Ashok, you think you should allot to?
We've got about 5 minutes. We're meant to finish at 7.
Okay. So thank you both, Anna and Anthony, for your careful reading and for some very, very consistent explorations of what I published and tried to convey. And I'm very satisfied with your ideas on borderline experience and on borderline disorders and the explorations the developments you've been adding to it. I wasn't aware of them. Sorry for that, unfortunately. And I see that I fully agree with you in the terms of this further understanding of the experience of borderline persons in terms of, I could say, with my terms, dialectical approach. That is, most specifically, your idea of the disruption of not agency, but the dialectic is between agency and non-agents. So this is the core of psychopathology. At the same time, seeing what is agents and what is lack of agents in the very behavior or in the very person. But this interpretation of pathology is very attuned to phenomenological ones. And I think we should talk more about that, because there are many points of contact that could, and bridging this to the Anthony's questions, to try to make a more lingua franca, a more comprehensible language for the real world, the enlarged world, broad world of mental health professionals, carers, and so on. Anthony, thanks again for your forwards and for new perspectives after the forwards. I'm very fond of your criticism. That's why I invited you. I like it very much. I think you have a very sharp reading of contemporary authors in phenomenological psychopathology, since you've been pointing out some weakness in the use of the concepts. And I think it's a very important topic. We have been using some concepts in a still to be determined way. And I think being clear in terms of that is very important. The meanings of the concept and the consequence of its meanings that is a field to be explored mostly by philosophers like you, though the psychiatrists should learn from you as well. Concerning your question, what to do with this jargon? I think this book, for instance, is a book which requires some initiation on phenomenological field. So I have no dreams of having it as a for the wide public audience, at least so far. Of course, we can try to convince and gradually teach people to use these categories. But so far, I think it's not an easy, it's been not an easy task, and we have still to be restricted to our jargons and to our community. On the other hand, directly to your question, what to do about this? Which concepts to keep, which concepts to abandon in order to reach a wider audience? This, Anthony, is an open question for sure. I think this is the reason we are here together today. For instance, we've been working with the center, how to get to the people, how to make our categories, our vision, and their visions as well, to get more comprehensible. I don't have a question for that, and I could only answer and end in my response saying that your questions should be very good questions to guide our publications from this moment on, for guide our way of thinking, our participation in the general society, not only in our academic worlds. Thank you very much for your opinions.